It is a pleasure to introduce to you the next keynote speaker for today, Hani Henry. Hani has received his PhD in clinical psychology from Miami University of Ohio. He is currently the Associate Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and the Associate Professor of Psychology at the American University in Cairo, Egypt. He is also the former chair of Sociology, Anthropology, Psychology, and Egyptology Department and the former graduate program director of the Counseling and Community Psychology programs at AUC. He has published numerous journal articles on diversity-related issues such as immigration, acculturation, women empowerment, internalized sexual stigma, and cultural sensitivity in psychotherapy. Hani Henry will talk about the ongoing crisis of sexual harassment in the Egyptian streets that has reached epidemic proportions. He will discuss a study that was conducted with male harassers that added cultural depth to the feminist theory's explanation of sexual harassment by highlighting the roles of participants' strict interpretations of religious text and experiences of societal oppression in justifying these acts. I'm looking forward to the talk, Sexual Harassments in the Egyptian Streets as a Continuing Crisis, a Cultural Perspective. And don't forget, please, to join us for the live Q&A discussion after the talk. A link will be provided.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to the presentation today. My name is Hani Henry. I'm from the American University in Cairo. First, I would like to thank you for coming to my presentation. And I would also like to thank the conference organizers, the American University in Paris, for putting such a great effort in allowing us to come and share our knowledge about many of the crises that face our world today. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I'm also excited to attend as many keynote speeches and or presentations as much as possible. They sound very interesting and informative, so I'm very excited to be here. Today, I will talk about sexual harassment in the Egyptian street. This has been a continuing crisis that has plagued Egypt for years or maybe decades. And I really wanted to talk about a couple of studies that I've conducted that can help us understand, not only understand the problem of sexual harassment in Egypt, but give us some hope in ways with which we can tackle this problem. And the reason I got interested in this is there's a particular holiday feast every year where sexual harassment in the Egyptian street becomes very rampant. And I actually received lots of media requests to be interviewed about this as a psychologist from the American University in Cairo. And so I said, you know what, I give people the basic psychological knowledge about what's happening, but I really wanted to examine this crisis closely and do a study on it. So this is an overview of what I will talk about today. The first thing I will talk about is the definition of sexual harassment that has guided the study. So what is the definition of sexual harassment that helped informed my study? And then I'll discuss the study that I conducted with Egyptian males who harassed women in the streets, and I'll explain the theoretical framework I use in understanding sexual harassment in this particular study, which is the feminist theory. And then I'll briefly give you an overview of another study I did, which was actually earlier about Egyptian women empowerment. And I'll try to illustrate how women empowerment can be a form of resistance and even a solution to sexual harassment. And finally, I'll end my presentation with recommendations to mental health professionals and policymakers who are tackling this crisis. So hopefully my study will allow people to get a deeper perspective on this issue as they design programs or as they intervene with into this problem. So it's very sad for me to say that any woman who walk in Egyptian streets, and it doesn't matter where you go, whether you go in upscale area or in in a poor neighborhood or middle class neighborhood, there's always going to be a form of harassment. And actually, there was a United Nations study that was conducted in 2013. It was a massive study, and they interviewed lots of women, Egyptian women, and actually 99.3% said that they were harassed one way or another, and actually staggering 64% said that they were touched inappropriately. 64%. And I actually have this study was cited in my paper on sexual harassment. It was published in Sexuality and Culture journal. And so this is a big problem. This is a serious problem, and the country tried as much as it can to have legislation against sexual harassment, and penalty get tough more and more. And I think the law has failed to do something about this problem, and it's still ongoing. And it's heartbreaking to see the suffering of women in the streets. And so I wanted us to understand this phenomenon, and I wanted to do a qualitative study on it. So this is the definition of sexual harassment that I used in the study. It's a behavior that humiliates or derogates an individual based on sex. That was Berdahl, 2007. So we're talking, in my study, I wanted to look at the humiliating or derogatory part of sexual harassment. We cannot deny that sexual harassment can have sexual reasons, but I wanted to look at the humiliating part of sexual harassment. I wanted to study it closely. So I wanted to use a theoretical perspective. In my qualitative study, I identify a theoretical framework, and I use it to explain my observations. And then I use my observations to modify and elaborate this theoretical understanding. And so I started with the feminist theory perspective, and it's very simple. They attribute proponents of feminist theory attribute sexual harassment to gender inequality and society's acceptance of male dominance, as well as its tolerance of aggression against women. So it must be seen in the context of women's diminished role in the patriarchal society, and has to be analyzed in a similar way to other feminist concerns such as rape and domestic violence. So in a sense, feminist theory sees sexual harassment not as a sexual act, but as a sexist act. And so this is something that we really need to look at, the methodic way of doing sexual harassment in Egypt, and its widespread occurrence wanted me to look at it institutionally. I didn't want to look at it individually, but I wanted to see what is it about the institutional messages that women receive that make sexual harassment normative for many people, and why people are not setting some boundaries on that, and why the laws are not helping, and why. What is the institutional aspect of sexual harassment that makes it so rampant and so widespread like that? So I really start with this feminist theory perspective. And so in my study on sexual harassment, I wanted to get an in-depth exploration of the applicability of this theory or its explanation of sexual harassment in the Egyptian cultural context. But not only that, so I wanted to see whether it's applicable to the Egyptian society or not. But I also wanted to integrate culturally based theoretical explanation of sexual harassment with these explanations. And so it's very important for me to explain to you that this study is not a quantitative study. We're not generalizing our finding. We are just saying, look, this is a big problem, that you can understand it from this angle, which is the feminist theory. But because the feminist theory sometimes, or any theory, needs to be culturally modified and elaborated to be relevant to the context in which you study it. And so that was the hope of the study. So yes, I'm going to use the feminist theory, or I use the feminist theory to explain how men justified sexual harassment, but I also used the narratives of these men to modify and elaborate feminist theory and make it more culturally relevant. And so again, when I really wanted to understand people's narrative, I used the theoretical assumptions of feminist theory. So again, it suggests that men harass women publicly in the streets because they, number one, they may believe that their action is normative. Number two, they may use harassment to control and dominate women. Number three, they may objectify and fail to empathize with their victims. Again, it really reflects all these themes, all these ideas, or assumptions, sorry, suggest that this is an institutional problem that allows men to dominate women and have tolerance for aggression against women and normalize women's oppression. And harassment can be used systemically and institutionally to subjugate women, right? So these are the assumptions. So I wanted to actually explain men's behavior that I interviewed using this theoretical understanding. So I did interview self-professed males. So here's the criteria. We have a very successful NGO called Harassment that actually allow people to know the hot spots in Egypt that they need to, or women, the hot spots in Egypt that you need to avoid if you don't want to be sexually harassed. And so I actually identified few areas, and I went there and I observed certain men harassing women. But I waited a little bit, and after they did their act, sometimes it's whistling, sometimes saying obscene words, sometimes getting close, dangerously close to women. And so I wanted to wait a few minutes, and then I approached them and I said, look, I'm a researcher. I really would like to interview you about the way, I didn't use the word harass. Harass in Arabic means taharush. And so people would be upset about this word. So I said teasing the women, ta'akas, which is teasing, yeah. And so actually people did accept, some people accepted to be interviewed by me, but also other people were kind of rough with me, and they thought I'm like police or undercover police or something. They ignored me or they cursed me. Anyway, I did interview a small sample of people, 8 people. I had the age range was 18 to 50. They varied in socioeconomic status, religion, educational level. But again, I just want to have this disclaimer. My job is not to tell you to do a quantitative study in which we can make generalization about sexuality. This is just a theory building study. So I'm using the theoretical perspective to understand this phenomenon. And I subjected the narratives that I collected from these folks into thematic analysis procedure that was guided by Brown and Clark. And at the end, I have 2 types of themes. Themes that were driven by the theory and themes that were driven by the data. And that was the point. It's like we use the theory to explain the observation and use the observation to modify and elaborate the theory. So these are my results. The narratives of the participants seem to corroborate with the theory of sexual harassment, feminist theory of sexual harassment, the assumption that is. So the first theme was sexual harassment is a normative act. So sub-themes, I had 3 sub-themes under this theme. Everyone does it, there's no harm done by sexual harassment, no empathy is needed. Why would they be upset about that, right? And then the second theme, which is also guided by feminist theory, sexual harassment is women's fault. It occurs because women are legitimate sex objects. Women are responsible, blaming the victim mentality here. And then finally, theme 3, sexual harassment is due to women's desire to work. And I'm going to give you quotes from each of these themes to kind of like give you deeper perspective and explain what we're talking about here. And of course, I had tons of themes, but I just wanted to pick the themes that were relevant or that capture the main, the quotes that capture the main theme. These were my data-driven themes. So these are themes purely driven by the data. They were not guided by the theory. So this is what I found throughout the interviews. A theme related to sexual harassment is God's punishment to women. I'll explain that. And another theme, which is data-driven as well. Women are harassed due to societal oppression. So women are harassed because everyone is harassed. Women are harassed because men are angry. So again, these are two types of themes. Themes that were driven by the theory, themes that were driven purely by the data. So I'm just going to give you some narratives that kind of capture each theme and maybe give you a better idea of what we're talking about. So I'll start with the themes that corroborate feminist theory perspective. So this is a guy, he's 19 years old. It captures the theme related to sexual harassment being a normative act. So what's wrong with saying a compliment to a pretty woman? They should like the attention and care. They should encourage it. It's normal. For him, it's normal. This is a 24-year-old young gentleman reflecting theme 2, sexual harassment is women's fault. There are individuals who threaten to post photographs of women who dress provocatively during the holy month of Ramadan on a Facebook page and shame them if they didn't stop doing that. I totally agree with that. We need to send strong message to these women and shame them. So it's like, these women are wearing things for him. They are provocative in their clothes. And not only that they deserve to be arrested, but they actually going to be shamed about it. Theme 3, sexual harassment is due to women's desire to work. So this really puzzles me. I would always expect my wife to wait for me, greet me with a smile, and pamper me with a nice meal. I am not sure how other men can function if they go home and cannot find their wives waiting for them. I think these women who don't do that deserve what they get in the streets. This is a 44-year-old gentleman, okay? So, I mean, there's not enough time for me to share with you the other narratives, but these were the themes that kind of corroborate feminist theory and the idea that women are to be blamed, women are objectified, there's no empathy for women, women have been punished for being in the streets, okay? So again, the idea is not to prove the theory. The idea is to modify and elaborate the theory according to the Egyptian cultural context. And this is what I found that this is the theme 4 and theme 5. So theme 4, which is a data-driven theme, sexual harassment is God's punishment to women. So this is a 22-year-old gentleman. Do you know the Honorable Sheikh Hani? This is a cleric, a Muslim cleric, very famous, very popular. He once told worshippers that a woman's face is like a vagina. This face should be covered the same way a vagina is covered. What do we conclude from this? Women should be covered and should stay home. They have no one to blame except themselves. If they leave home, someone touches them. So this is a new perspective, right? So we're not talking just about societies punishing women, but here God is also punishing women for going out in the streets. The fifth theme, so this is the religious aspect. Let's see the social aspect here. Societal oppression has to do with it as well. So this is a 33-year-old who was very upset that I'm doing a study on women harassment. So he said, you're worried so much about women getting arrested and are doing a study on them. Why don't you do a study on our harassment as human beings in this country? We have no rights or dignity. We're humiliated every day. We're not treated as human. Okay, so let me just put this in perspective. Feminist theory is very relevant to understand sexual harassment in Egypt and to understand it more of an institutional problem or sexism against women, not sexual act, it's a sexist act. And the theme seemed to corroborate the assumptions of feminist theory in understanding sexual harassment. But we need to also look at the Egyptian cultural context and try to add more to the feminist theory. Religious and socio-cultural markers added depth to the initial theoretical explanation of sexual harassment as offered by feminist theory. And these are the two take-home messages from the study. So we said that sexual harassment is a sign of women objectification. No, so actually the participants' strict interpretation of religious text led them to further justify the objectification of women. So that's the religious aspect, it's the misinterpretation of religion. And then the social aspect, it seems like some participants might have also identified with the violent behavior of those who violated, disempowered, and oppressed them. And then they directed their oppression to the women they harassed. And I'm reminded with Ferenczi's concept of identification with the aggression. It's a psychoanalytical concept, almost like you cannot face your aggressor, so you displace your aggression into a weaker person. And that's exactly where the study had helped me understand sexual harassment. So yes, feminist theory is important, but we also need to modify and elaborate it. So, okay, I'm sorry I depressed you about how sexual harassment has been institutionally reinforced. You tolerate aggression towards women, you subjugate women in a patriarchal society, you fail to empathize with them, you objectify them, right? And then not only that, but then there are you're misusing religious texts to further oppress women, and you are displacing, as a man, you're displacing your own oppression into someone who is socially weaker than you by purview of the privilege you have, right? So, okay, so this is important, right? But we're psychologists and we really need to think about how to tackle this. And so earlier than, I did a study, earlier study on women empowerment in Egypt. And the study was also guided by Paulo Freire principles of empowerment. He used critical pedagogy. And he said that people should not use education just to learn and read, but should learn their education to think critically about their education, because this would allow them to deeply examine their reality and actually identify their rights. So people can empower themselves if they use their critical view of education to gain understanding of existing social, economic, and political forces that affect their lives. And not only that, but try to identify their rights and seek to get them, right? So for him, education should not just be about you being literate, but it should be about empowering you to know what's your right and how can you change your environment. And actually, I found in the women that I interviewed that they actually, these principles of empowerment was very relevant to how they conduct their lives. So I find that many Egyptian women are able to acquire knowledge of the conditions that maintain their oppression, and they're aware of them, and they seek knowledge. And then they use this knowledge to take actions to change these conditions. And they also use knowledge to create conditions that make the system work better for them. So, but of course, in my study, because our society tends, the majority at least, or the trend to acquire, to adopt a collectivistic view of life, which means that in order for the family to be intact, women had to do a lot of sacrifices. And the society, if the society is still cohesive, it's because of these women, the way they give, the way they sacrifice, the way they put themselves last in the family. Yet, despite all of that, and despite the sacrifices, it doesn't matter what socioeconomic status we're talking about. In this study, I found that women were able to get that knowledge and to know that they've been wronged sometimes, that they've been deprived of their rights, that they've been subjugated by society. Yet they did try or attempt to take back their rights, but in a way that was culturally sensitive. So, for example, I am not going to be able to change. As a woman told me that she's not able to change her husband's uh, gender stereotyping and gender role rigidity, but she'll work to instill flexibility in her kids and to teach them that there's no difference between men and women, and that sometimes women are even better. And so, and sometimes they did some way where they really try to get the rights in a very assertive way, but again, in a culturally sensitive way, in a way that doesn't threaten the harmony of their families or their society. So I'm very hopeful that if we can apply women empowerment principle to Egyptian women, and I've already illustrated that in my study, my second study, that we can actually use this empowerment as a form of resistance against sexual harassment. And I think a big problem is that sometimes many women in Egypt have internalized the message that they are objects, that their body is shameful, that they really need to be careful about the way they present themselves and the way they're dressed. So it's almost like internalization of hate. And so the message you get is that there's something wrong with you. You should be ashamed of your body. You internalize this message. So nothing is changing. And we don't have enough people to fight back. So women empowerment can be a way for women to fight back. So I will finally end my presentation with recommendations I provide for mental health professionals and policymakers. There has been some prevention programs that have been initiated by the country, and they should really focus on decreasing the tolerance of aggression of men against women. So we're not just talking about tolerance of aggression when it comes to sexual harassment, but about the way women are portrayed, the way women are characterized, whether in the media or even in educational system. So this is something that prevention programs have to really tackle heads on. It's like, why are we accepting that aggression? What is it about our society that allow us to accept it? Another thing we can do is to teach empathy and personal boundaries. And it's very important to kind of like explain to people, look, can you imagine if you were walking on the street and some people just harassed you as a male? How would you feel? And then they would say, for example, I would beat them. I said, well, what if you can't beat them? Women cannot beat men who harass them. So you would have to engage in a conversation with people about respecting empathy, teaching empathy, respecting personal boundaries, A lot of issues also have to do with collectivistic society. The porous, that we have porous boundaries sometimes. So we don't want to let go of this porous boundaries, but we need to know that sometimes these porous boundaries may lead to violate the other person. And finally, I would really like to say that we need to revamp religious rhetoric. It may eventually, we have to say that there's a lot of people, preachers and clerics and priests, who tend to blame the victim, tend to blame women for their harassment because of the way they dress, because of the way they walk. Sometimes some of them twist religious texts to further blame women and make them feel guilty. So we really need to work on this, so that we can create a healthy social climate for women. I mean, one other thing I wanted to add as well, but it's not in the slide, is the latest studies on prevention of sexual harassment. We can't keep telling men, don't. You know, the more you say to men, don't, the more they will do it. This is human condition. But we need to say to people, okay, it's okay if you're attracted to a woman. It's very normal. It's very natural. But don't act on it. Don't act on it. And that's where we talk about crossing the boundaries and objectifying women. So I tell people, you know, I can't tell you don't look at a woman that you're attracted to. That's fine. Of course, don't stare at her, but don't act on it. Don't harass her. Don't stare at her. Don't accept that you have a natural inclination to be attracted to women if you're heterosexual. And that's fine. But don't take the next step. Thank you very much. And I look forward to hear your questions and discussion. Looking forward to have a healthy discussion. I did record this because I wanted to make sure that we don't have internet problems in Egypt. So thank you. Thank you very much.